Conquer the Noise is a podcast produced by Unconquered, an independent agency challenging brand perspective through redefined content. This podcast is dedicated to telling stories of outstanding ideas and people who have found their way amongst the chatter. Hey everyone, we have a great show today featuring Duncan Meisel and Jamie Henn, founders of Clean Creatives. If you work in marketing, you've probably heard the name before, but if you haven't, Clean Creatives is a nonprofit that is working to get PR and ad agencies to commit to refusing any future contracts with fossil fuel companies, trade associations, or front groups that help reduce the impact these companies have. Jamie, Duncan, thank you so much, guys, for joining us today.
Great to be here.
So, Jamie, you are leading the charge over fossil free media, and Duncan, you're leading the charge at Clean Creatives. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
So I would love to just get, I think, a breakdown of how they started, how the two of you got together. And just the genesis of the entire program that you're doing.
Sure. Well, I can kick things off. This is Jamie, and then I'll pass it over to my fearless comrade, Duncan. So fossil free media started about 2 years ago at the beginning of 2020. And before that, both Duncan and I had worked together at an organization called 350.org, which is an international climate campaign. And I was one of the co-founders there and spent over a decade working with 350 and helping build that into one of the world's largest nonprofits working on the climate crisis. And most of my roles over there were something to do with communications, a variety of different hats. But over the years, we worked on a lot of campaigns together, from the fossil fuel divestment movement to the People's Climate March to the fight against Keystone XL to the global climate strikes with Greta and the other incredible young people in 2019. And as I was coming up on my 10-year anniversary there and sort of thinking about next steps for myself, I was able to take a step back and really look out across the climate movement and see that a lot of the tools that we had at 350 as a mid-size to larger NGO just weren't accessible to grassroots groups on the ground, or the types of kind of coalitions that were coming together to take on the fossil fuel industry and fight fossil fuel projects. And so fossil free media was born out of that desire to try and take some of the best tools in terms of communications and digital that we'd figured out and strategies that we'd been using over the last decade, and really bring those to the fight for climate justice and the fight against the fossil fuel industry. And so a lot of what fossil free media does is just provide that sort of support to grassroots groups and coalitions taking on the fossil fuel industry. But we knew that as we did that, and as we tried to get our message out, that wasn't going to be enough. If there wasn't some way that we could also take on the industry's ability to be pushing their message with the millions upon millions of dollars that they spend on fossil fuel advertising and PR. And so that was where some of the genesis for Duncan and my early conversations about Clean Creatives started. So maybe I'll pass it over to him for that.
Yeah. So I think the moments I think about, one was we were during the 2020 election, Jamie and I were looking at some of the ads that were being run by the American Petroleum Institute, which is the largest and oldest oil industry lobby in the world. And we thought initially, like, okay, we'll just look at one of these ads and we'll figure out who made it and we'll make them feel really bad about themselves, And what we realized at that time was actually that the ads were being made by an agency in Austin, Texas, where I live. And Austin is a nice, progressive, creative town. Mm-hmm. And what I thought was like, oh, these people who work at the agency, GSD&M, they probably aren't that excited about working for Exxon. Like, I don't know them personally, but I know what they're like. I know, the city they're in, the vibe they have. So that's probably something they're not very excited about. And then the other thing was, Jamie came across this ad from Philip Morris, with the tobacco company, and it was legitimately so bad I thought it was a joke. It was just like terrible stock footage, terrible message. And it sort of clicked for me. It's like, oh, I know that people have decided they don't want to work for tobacco companies in this creative industry. And as a result, they actually can't persuade the public as much as they used to. And so sort of put two and two together that, like, it's probably the case that a lot of creative people in a lot of different agencies aren't excited about this. And if we can sort of build a path with those people away from working for the fossil fuel industry, we can make it harder for them to oppose all the things that Jamie and I have been working on when we worked at 350 and other places. So I think that's sort of the picture of how we came to do this.
Mm-hmm. And so some of the clean creatives work, how are you reaching those people then at those agencies? Are you going after the employees themselves? Are you going after the leadership? And what is really the goal? Are you trying to, fight disinformation? Is that part of the program? Is that, agencies, PR firms are shifting messages to be more sympathetic or, pro these different fuels, or is it all of the above?
I think there's two things to look at here. One is just the fundamental reality of the climate emergency, which is that we are in the red alert moment. The 3/4 of global carbon pollution comes from the energy sector. And the companies that make up the biggest part of that sector are planning to continue growing their pollution. That is their plan. It's the thing they keep telling shareholders. It's the thing they keep disclosing with their financial plans. And that growth is incompatible with a safe planet. And they work with agencies, PR and advertising agencies, in order to continue growing. It is a crucial part of their business strategy to do the thing that is destroying the planet. And so there's just a basic relationship there that needs to be broken, that agencies that facilitate that growth should stop because it is dangerous. The second thing I would say is the misinformation and just the dishonesty that goes into this work. And you'd actually be surprised about like the long lineage of greenwashing. It's not something that's a recent invention. It's something that has been happening for decades and decades. And it's the core of the industry strategy. They've always said, we want to be part of the solution. This is old story you can look up about the person who invented the press release worked for Rockefeller. And when Rockefeller's owned a mine in Colorado, a bunch of people went on strike. He hired some security guards. The security guards killed a lot of those workers. What did he do? He didn't say, this was a false flag or fake news. He went there and says, I want to listen. I want to make things better for you. And that was in 1914. And so this saying we're part of the solution is the strategy. It is the core of the disinformation problem that we have. And it is the thing that's used most often to defeat climate action, which requires limiting the power and profits of these companies. So those are the two threads. Just like we need to look at the science here, which is this is irresponsible business to be taking on. And second, looking at the misinformation problem as a really crucial threat to both climate action and to just like the general welfare of the public. Jamie, do you have any thoughts to add to that?
No, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And Jonathan, maybe just taking the second part of your question about how we reach out to people. The good news is that I think that there are people throughout the advertising and PR sector, just like there are throughout any sector in our economy, who really care deeply about this problem and really know that the climate crisis is the defining challenge that we're facing as a society and civilization, and feel, as Duncan's saying, somewhat icky about the fact that they're having to work on these accounts or they're having to put out these commercials. And so we found it actually, really inspiring to connect with hundreds upon hundreds of individual creatives, some of whom work at boutique agencies who are already committed to these values, some of whom are in the world's largest PR and ad agencies who work, make millions of dollars working with companies like Exxon and Shell. And so that's really where this campaign has thrived, is finding those messengers who can help transform the industry from the inside. And I think that's a model we're seeing not just in the advertising and PR sector, but also at law firms, with management consultants, and just with the business sector in general, where people are saying, look, we need to redefine the way that we think about our mission and purpose. And we need to put out some bright lines about what we're not going to do in order to really address this. If there's one of the profound shifts we need to make in terms of dealing with climate change is that we can't always be in the mode of, more is always better, that you can just kind of do more to get yourself out of the crisis. You can just invent yet another brand and then that will solve the problem. At a certain point, we actually have to start saying no to things, and we have to actually, really move away from some practices of the past. And in this case, some fuels of the past that are destroying our planet.
Yeah, there's a lot of I think contradictory messages going on right now between the idea of saying, oh, we're working towards carbon neutral. On behalf some of these agencies anyway, some of these brands who are polluters or working with heavy polluters. And then you see on the other side, there's the opposite, where the work that they're doing is actually creating more pollution than the offsets that they're pledging. And I think that, that was always sort of a suspicion of mine, but I didn't really realize the power of that until I saw the breakdown that Clean Creatives did when they started analyzing the amount of I guess, contradiction there is between those statements there. Was that something that you deliberately went after as far as trying to like bust, quote unquote, the idea, the misinformation, or like do the myth busting of, carbon offsets versus the work they're actually doing? Or was that something you just sort of stumbled upon as you're, reading through the mission statements and sort of trying to connect the dots?
I think, that's something that has been, if you're a climate activist, like Duncan and I have been working on this for a long time, that's one of the perennial daily frustrations you deal with, is kind of looking at the data and saying, wait, this latest, Exxon just came out last week with the net zero pledge, and it takes like 30 seconds of, looking at their actual financials, or even just at their kind of latest disclosures to shareholders, to realize it's complete and utter BS. And yet, that doesn't matter in the end if Exxon's able to spend tens of millions of dollars on advertisements convincing the public that they really care. And so it was that disconnect between the reality of the crisis and what these companies were doing, and then the advertising that they were putting out, that really crystallized this approach for us, that, roughly 1% of oil industry spending is going towards renewables. And even out of that percent, a lot of it is going to kind of false solutions that are never going to work and just perpetuate our dependence on fossil fuels. But if you look at their advertising, you'd think that these were like happy-go-lucky renewable energy companies that were run by small children waving daisies in fields somewhere. I mean, it's completely different. And I think that that's the kind of hypocrisy that we're looking to expose. And we can talk more about why that's so important, because I think it's not just that's not just a frustrating reality that these companies greenwash. That really is one of, I think, the largest barriers to our society being able to deal with this problem, and ultimately our political process being able to result in the type of changes that we need to see.
Duncan, do you want to add to that?
I just think one of the things I've learned in this process is that the first target of the greenwashing and misinformation is the agency. That like these companies come to the agency and they say, we're ready to make change. We want you to help us do X and Y. And they have to paint a rosy picture. And I think it's really disconcerting and hard to come to grips with like, oh, I'm not really sure I can trust this client. I think that's a very hard and difficult conversation to have. So, I understand the challenge. And I think we're pointing out those contradictions and trying to direct people back to the data in order to ground a conversation with your clients or potential clients, say, are you actually serious about this? And pointing out the ways they're not. I think that the data and the information we're trying to surface is really in service of that, and helping people be more direct and clear-eyed about the challenges here.
Yeah, well, I definitely think there's a level of due diligence that is required from, I think, any responsible agency owner or agency should have when accepting clients, whether it's a fossil fuel brand or not. I think going through any sort of having sort of a matrix of, do we take this work, and having a guide, I think that helps make those decisions is really important. But at a certain point, I mean, and I'm not going to call out our clients specifically for this, but anytime we do an intake call, the way the clients talk about themselves, and then the way you look at the data and the research from the strategy work that we do, there's usually a misalignment there. So I think in general, I will just say agencies know better as far as to take things just for face value from coming out of a potential client's mouth, because there's always just a level of drinking the Kool-Aid, I guess you could say, putting it lightly. So I'm curious, like the solution, I think people are often like really confused. They don't know what to do, or they're not sure, like, all right, for clean energy, then how are we going to do that? We can't just change the infrastructure overnight. And what I find fascinating when I read through a lot of the materials on your social media and the website and the various hundreds of articles that have been published about your initiatives. I don't see a real focus on like necessarily a solution on how to transition over to clean energy. I'm the messaging that I get around a lot of the work that you're doing is really focused on how can we stop disinformation. Would you say that's a correct analysis of how I'm perceiving what you're doing, your organization?
No, I think that's fair. I mean, and part of that comes from just a strategic look at the landscape that we're in. I think Duncan laid it out really well in terms of like the centrality of fossil fuels and driving the climate crisis. It's sort of worth trying to think about, how the next decade needs to go if we're really going to get our hands around this problem. The good news is that renewable energy is surging. I mean, there have been such incredible advances in solar, wind, battery technology, and 1,000 other things that go along with it that really give us the tools we need to make the transition to, 100% renewable energy that powers a fully electrified economy. So that's the good news. The bad news is that we're not going to make that transition fast enough at the current rate we're going. We're not putting up solar panels fast enough. We're not retrofitting our grid well enough. We're not selling enough electric cars. And so the question is then, what's the barrier to that? And from our analysis, the need is not to go out and cheerlead renewable energy more. The public loves renewable energy. I mean, the public support for solar and wind is off the charts, and it's bipartisan. The problem is that there's a huge block to moving that economy forward, and that's the power the fossil fuel industry continues to exert over our political process, as we've seen with President Manchin, or Senator Manchin, I guess, over the last year, and the power that it continues to hold over our economy. That they're able to box out the transition to renewables because of the build out that they already have and the sort of ways that they're built into our regulatory process. And so, our focus in some ways is going after the bad guys, because to us, that's the piece that, is sort of potentially more controversial maybe, or isn't quite as easy to do as sort of just cheerleading for renewable energy all the time. But I think it is really what's going to be necessary to make this transition. And, we've seen the ability to kind of break an industry's political stranglehold in the past. And I think big tobacco is the clear example there. And, a lot of the ways that we think about going after big oil, we're pulling from that experience of seeing the pivotal role that actually tackling the misinformation the tobacco industry was putting out allowed sort of political progress on that issue. And so I think that that's, one of the reasons why we're zeroing in. So all that to say, I'm so thankful for like the engineers and everybody who are working on solutions day to day. I think when it comes to advocates and activists, the key place where we do need to focus some of our energies is to push back on the big oil and the industry's ability to continue to block progress as it comes.
I think it's a great way to say it. I as I said, I follow you all on social media, and I read this conversation on a thread from last week that was started from a post that was made, talking through the 450 or so scientists that published a letter to the ad and PR world, stating like, basically drop your fossil fuel clients. This is a big deal. You're a major piece of the puzzle, which I think is incredibly powerful to read, because I think if there's anything, science has been politicized over the last year or two, but I would say it's definitely one of those things that helps support with actual numbers and data. But in that thread, there was someone from a CEO of a large media company who chimed in and was saying, that I think this is terribly misguided, and that the economy really would collapse without these big fossil fuel brands, and the goal should not be to shun them, but to rather work with them to support the transition to cleaner energy. And we've talked a little bit about them as far as like, where their investments are going. We're not really seeing an investment in these clean energy initiatives. They're just sort of doubling down. But I would love to hear your response to that and your thoughts to that. So I don't think that's really far off from what a lot of people are thinking.
Yeah, it's really the case that the creative industry is full of people who have incredible talent and want to do the right thing. And I do not discount anyone saying, I really want to be part of the solution here, and this seems like one way to do it. I think that's great. I think the challenge is you're dealing with a lot of entrenched bad habits. The oil companies have known about climate change since the 70s. They published about it. They talked to themselves. The American Petroleum Institute knew about this in the 70s. And they've spent 50 years not changing their plans, doing the exact same thing that over and over and over again. And I just think that needs to be a moment where you come to grips with like what that means for your options and your opportunities to take action. And just thinking in this conversation about solutions, one way to look at it, and this is a quip from our friend Bill McKibben, who's an author, when you're in a hole and you need to get out of it, the first step is to stop digging and taking a step back and saying, I don't want to be a part of this industry until they can prove that they have solutions and that they are really putting their money where their mouth is on this, is the highest leverage action you can take. Because you have something that they need, which is creativity. And so I think of that taking this step back is the stop digging moment. It's the first step towards the solution. And it's the thing that offers you the most leverage when it comes to making sure that you're committing to something that is legitimate, that it does have credibility, that does build solutions. It was very striking in that thread, which I replied to there when in that conversation on LinkedIn. There is, the person who raised that said, like, well, why don't we work with companies like Shell, and who are like really leading the transition? And if Shell is your leader, you have a problem. Like Shell, every time they talk about their net zero plan, they have a legal disclaimer attached to that advertisement that says, our budgets and business plans do not reflect our net zero goal. It is just in black and white. And so I thought that conversation was striking, just for pointing out that even the leader, even though someone who looks at this as a business leader points out, here's someone who's at the forefront, that company admits that they're not doing enough. And I think that just sort of tells the whole story in one way. So I thought that conversation was really interesting. I hope that people reading it took that, I'm sympathetic to the idea of wanting to do better and wanting to help. But I think the reality is that these companies have not made it possible to help while collaborating with them. They have cut that off themselves.
Mm-hmm. I just add, I mentioned the kind of big tobacco metaphor, a minute ago. And I think it's worth kind of putting yourself in the shoes, if you're thinking about, well, why wouldn't we work with an oil company to help them, make the transition or convince people that they care about renewable energy? I mean, just imagine being, sitting in a room in the early 90s, and you're sitting with Philip Morris and they come in and say, look, we have low tar cigarettes now. We're putting better filters on all of them. We're really committed to making this product healthier. Our hope is that we'll transition away from cigarettes, 30 years from now. But in the meantime, we really need you to convince the public that we're not out there hurting people. We're trying to help. Like people would look back and say, there's no way you should take that job. I mean, you know that the industry's lying. You know that their solutions weren't right. All the public health experts were saying this was a crisis, that we needed to get a handle on smoking. That's the same problem we're in right now. But people are believing Shell and Exxon when they walk in the room and spin the same sort of lies about their product, even though the core of their business is continuing to pollute our climate, just like the tobacco industry was polluting the lungs of the public as well. And so I think that that's why this kind of advertising around solutions is actually so dangerous, is because it is just another form of denial that allows the industry to keep operating like they are, but under the veneer that they're doing something different. And actually, I think that's a greater threat than outright climate denial. Outright climate denial is easy to see. If Exxon was out there saying climate change isn't real, the public would instantly, turn on them, wouldn't trust them. So instead, they're saying, we care. And that's a harder message to go after, because I think all of us, we do want a solution. We do want to feel like these industries are making progress, but I don't think we can be that naive. I mean, we have to really look at this problem square-eyed and think about the ways that we need to make a serious transition in our economy. And that's not going to happen if we keep empowering the same people that got us into the problem.
I think one way for at least, American culture to consider things is always the business case. It's always like, talk about the bottom line, talk about the numbers. How's this going to affect me? How's it going to affect my business? How's it going to affect my job, et cetera? And I'm curious to hear your business case for agencies not taking it, right? Not taking the work. Because if they're going to turn down a couple $1 million or whatever it is, what's the business case for them as far as this effect? Can it help improve culture? Can it help improve recruitment? Can this, what are the things that are that agencies stand to gain from actually losing some money up front?
There are three areas we look at on this. One is recruitment and retention. And I think it's a really, there's some clear issues there, and there's some subtleties. One is just that this is a talent-driven industry. In particular, when it comes to recruiting and retaining young talent, we know that young people are more engaged on the climate crisis and better educated about the climate crisis than their older peers, and that they see it as essential to have their workplace align with their values. And this is a deeply held value for them. I also think that there's some subtleties there, particularly if you're running like a public affairs firm, or you have people that want to move between working in for-profit and nonprofit, or for-profit and government, that, if you see this fossil fuel aligned agency on a resume, it may actually be hard for you to get that next job. And it may actually be a risk for your reputation. And it may not be something, you may have to build big blank spots in your resume for that outreach. And I think that's a challenge. And I think it's something that staff will think about it and should think about, honestly, because it is something we've heard happening, that it's a real issue for them. So there's a recruitment and retention conversation. It's a talent-driven industry, and that just is the bottom line. Another thing is thinking about brands that are doing the right thing and the risks that working with fossil fuel industries presents to them. And there are two risks. One is just a business risk, right? If you have GM as a client and GM wants to sell 100% electric vehicles by 2030, they need policies in place that Shell, Exxon, BP, Chevron, Aramco all oppose. That is a threat to their business model. And so there's a tension there. You could almost say a direct conflict of interest between if I help Shell make money, I can't help GM make money. Those things are actually in tension. But then there's also just sort of a cynicism risk that these are the world's biggest polluters. They're also the biggest greenwashers. And that greenwashing poses a risk to brands in the form of cynicism on the part of consumers. And that if you have a brand that is making genuine investments in sustainability, you want consumers to be able to identify that and to be able to support you as a result of it. But if they can't tell the difference between your ads and BP's, one of two things can happen. Either they can say, it's all bullshit. Or two, they can say, well, why not just continue what I'm doing? Why should I have to change my behaviors of brands? And then the last is just this, I would say, a broad reputational risk. This is an industry that knows better than anyone else on the planet about the value of brand reputation. And there are real risks here. It's not a savory business to work with the fossil fuel companies. And there's legitimate investigations by attorneys general, by Congress, by all sorts of bodies, by cities that are leading lawsuits that are focused on consumer fraud, that are focused on misleading the public. And it's not Exxon CEO writing their ads, it's their agency. And I think it's going to be very hard to avoid being drawn into those conversations as time goes on. And that's not a place you want to see your business, I think, either in the news or in a subpoena of some kind. It's just not great. So those are the three sort of business cases that we try and make. And then, we are in conversations with bigger brands about how they want to approach their agency development process. And when next time they do an agency review, this might be a question from some big brands of are we going to be caught up in this mess if you have fossil fuel clients, things like that. So that's the way we're looking at it. Jamie, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I would just say as an anecdote, when Duncan and I are running this campaign, obviously we're always looking for examples of agencies that are working with the fossil fuel industry to highlight. And I would say it is very rare to actually see an agency list a fossil fuel client on their website. Like we have to go digging through the 990s of the American fuel and petrochemical manufacturers to realize that they hired Edelman to do XYZ. It takes real digging, and that should be a sign. I mean, if you're embarrassed to put these people on your website, like maybe you shouldn't be working with them. And I think we've already reached that point. It's really rare. And in fact, since we started our campaign, we have noted that a few agencies have taken down certain clients that they have worked with in the past. And so, it's like, I think we just need to look in the mirror here and think it's 2022. I mean, think about how people feel right now about the threat of climate change and about the role this industry has played in lying to us. Now, fast forward 5 years, 10 years from now, because climate impacts are going to get worse before we turn the corner on this problem. And as we look back from 2032, I mean, if you think big tobacco looks bad, like this industry is destroying the entire planet. And do you really want to be the firm that said we didn't know enough in 2022 and we thought it was okay to keep working with them? I just don't think that's going to be an acceptable answer to the public, to our kids, to any of us ourselves. And so I think that's something people need to ask themselves if they want to be the kind of laggard on that, or if they want to be the vanguard of kind of a new economy going forward. And, and that's beyond just a business issue. That's sort of why we do this work that we do. And I think now is the time that those questions really need to be asked.
Yeah, well, I think those are all excellent points. And one of the things that I kind of come in conflict with, I think, is like the role of government now to a certain extent in enabling and preventing, or, I guess, preventing some of this future progress through just some of the corrupt practices that are currently going on still. So at some point, I mean, do you think we're going to have to run counter messaging against some of the governmental policies to start making changes? I'm really curious if we have a really aware advertising industry that is no longer advertising the products or no longer advertising the services. Then now we have sort of an infrastructural challenge ahead of us, which I think really starts at the government side. So how, for type of conversation, I'm really curious about how we can start making some of those advancements or conversations happen outside of the agency world, maybe more on the government and policy side.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'll try and tackle it quickly first, and then
I know it's not one you can just like sum up in 5 minutes.
We have a 3-part plan to do this. But look, since I know we're talking a lot about brands and businesses here, I think there actually is a really critical role for folks to be playing, and that's that, as I said earlier, there's widespread public acceptance that climate change is a crisis. There's widespread public support for clean energy policy, but it still doesn't move forward. And I think that one of the reasons why is because people still have this false conception, that was created through years of advertising, that we can't live without fossil fuels, that they're critical to the economy, they're critical to our way of life, that they're the great job creator in this country. All of those are proving false year after year. There are more jobs in renewable energy now than in fossil fuels. There's only a few, very few people still working in the coal industry. Obviously, we have to take care of them, but the idea that they're the kind of beating heart of this economy just is false. But people don't realize that and don't feel that. And that's where I think business and brands have a real ability to say, we're actually part of a new economy. We're part of an economy that's trying to solve these problems. We're part of an economy that's thinking about how it could be more circular, how it can deal with issues of waste. We want to create a society that not only addresses climate change, but racial justice, social inequality, gender justice, all the things that go along with that. And every time that people see it, they start to believe it. And I think that's the biggest hurdle we're trying to get people over is believing that this can actually happen. That, they believe climate change is a problem, but I think the problem is convincing people we can do something about it, and having brands out there saying, we're doing something about it. We believe in this new future is so important and so helpful, because honestly, that's the barrier, the Biden administration is facing right now. I think they have a lot of good people who want to do the right thing, but they just don't feel like they have the political cover to do so. And the more that we're all out there showing them that there's a constituency for that and that this is really possible, I think the more we'll see politicians begin to move into that space and be willing to take the political hits that they know they're going to get from the fossil fuel industry, Which brings us back to, it would be helpful if big PR firms weren't helping the fossil fuel industry go after politicians who are trying to do the right thing in this issue.
Yeah, I think that the other thing I would add is that a huge barrier here is just like this kind of mythology, which is a storytelling problem. And I live in Texas. I grew up here. There's a huge mythology around the power and of oil, where, just in your mind, I can remember my dad telling me essentially like oil equals infinite wealth and power. That's the story that people have internalized. And it's just not the case anymore. And, when I first met Jamie, we started working at 350. When I started working at 350, Exxon was the richest company in the history of money. They made more money every year than any company had ever. And now they are not on the Dow at all. They were delisted because the value of their company has gone down so precipitously. And that is true across the industry. The growth trajectory here is not the same. The income is not the same. And they're coming up against these other massive industrial actors that have quite different interests. And not just the example of the automakers. Like, you could talk about insurance companies, which is a huge part of the financial services industry, and they can't afford to continue insuring as much as they can because of the climate crisis. You can look at the power sector, which is transformed. You could just like start going down the line about all these different businesses that need different things now. And I think the calculus and the opportunity is like, okay, we need to make a judgment call about where we grow from here. Are we going to go with this dying industry? Are we going to continue investing in something that hasn't helped us deal with this massive problem? Or do we align with all these business interests that want to see change? And that I think is the opportunity in government. And I think it starts with understanding the shift in the story, and you can and being willing to like commit to telling a different kind of story about this industry. And then from there, I think all sorts of opportunities open up. And the one like silver lining to the kind of dire nature of the climate science is that the steps are actually really clear of like what we need to do next. This is one of the most well-researched problems on planet Earth. And the answer is you stop growing your pollution from fossil fuel sources and you start growing clean energy. And like all that technology, it works, it can be deployed, it's increasingly affordable. Like it's extremely straightforward, the things we need to do. And that's a certain kind of comfort. It's just a question of speed and will. And that's something that we have a lot of power over. You don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to like go into engineering to discover a new kind of solar panel. You just need to be involved wherever you can to make it more easily to deploy.
The reference to storytelling, it made me immediately think of the Clampetts and like the Beverly Hillbillies striking rich with their gold. And I would love to see like the 2022 version of them striking renewable energy and,
it's the solar panel,
finding a solar panel and redoing reformatting the story there. I think storytelling is a really huge role in getting people to buy in and participate in the messages that they're being put out there. And it makes me wonder, so you have advertising, you have PR, they're different but they're kind of the same. PR traditionally gets put in newspapers, press. Advertising you kind of see or you try not to see. You scroll past them, you change the channel. My grandparents used to always mute the commercials when they'd come on TV. Do you think one has more power than the other sense of where they're being placed I guess you could say, but there's validity around being put in a newspaper, so it automatically makes it true for some people. So I obviously have my opinion on which is going to be worse or which one might have more effect. But and I'm not trying to put these two industries against each other, but I'm just curious, if you have found in your research if there's something that supports that, or what your experience is.
I don't know if we've ever talked about this, Duncan. We should just say on 3 what we think. Or you make the case for one, and I'll make the case for the other.
I was going to say that, a lot of advertising with these industries is essentially lobbying in public. They're doing the as Jamie said, we're an industry of small children with butterflies thing, and it's not trying to be like, look how great gasoline is. It's really just doing this sort of vague innovation, connection, and that is designed to be lobbying, essentially. But it's lobbying the public in order to influence what policymakers see as the alternatives available to them. So, and honestly, like the decisions about strategy are across these different disciplines are kind of made in the same rooms, made by similar people. And we don't really look at them as kind of two super distinct industries. There's people who take different roles within this sort of influence machine. That's how we look at it. But I don't know. I don't think I could really separate them out so far as to be able to say one or the other.
Yeah, that's probably the right answer. I'll pick one, which is I'm going to say advertising, and here's why. I think that PR is the day-to-day way that we wage this battle. So, like, we come up against fossil fuel industry PR people all the time. But that's something that advocates can really deal with. Like we also can get a press list. I can reach out to the Washington Post. Yes, it is damaging and it needs to stop, but it's something that we at least have a way to kind of like push back on. Advertising is just a whole nother ballgame. I mean, the amount of money that these companies are pouring into these ads, like the environmental movement is never going to be able to match that. Like the public's never going to be able to buy a Super Bowl ad. Like I can't go out and make my voice heard in that way. And, and especially that's not just TV now, it's across social media, the way it's shaping the very reality that people exist in. And so I think as much as like PR is the pointy end of the spear here and the thing that we maybe come up against, like in the policy arena in a day-to-day way, it's advertising that sort of sets the entire field for that fight. And I think that that's why as advocates, we've just kind of come to see, as Duncan said, it's like, this is this sort of unseen world that establishes the way we think about things. And I think that so many advocates are there, in DC or in capitals around the country trying to make progress, and you just keep running up against these problems and this misinformation. And that started with the kind of ads that are out there. And that is weaponized by the PR people that go and take those falsehoods and try and use them to block the type of progress that we need to see.
And I know we're about running on time. I know you guys have to have a hard out, but I think it'd be great to talk through and just lightly conversation, talking points, things that you have found that help with the conversations. I have found, just from my personal experiences, that they escalate quickly. People get very angry very quickly. I don't know if it says more about the people I'm hanging out with, but I find that emotions kind of run high when it comes to the climate change debate and discussion. And I'm curious and I say this because I've read a lot of the threads that you're in having these conversations, and they're always clear, concise, level-headed. And I think, in my opinion, I think they should be or are a great representation of how they handle the discussion. So there is actual dialogue, and when someone's angry, the listening just switches off. Do you have any advice for people to help navigate these difficult conversations? If this is something that they care about, are there things on your site that can help people have ammo for these types of conversations to help back up the causes or the stats?
Yeah, if you go to cleancreatives.org/start, you'll actually find kind of our starter kit for leading these conversations. And there's two things that I think about here. One is that if you have this concern in your agency, I can essentially guarantee that someone else does too. We have never spoken to someone in an agency, no matter how big, no matter how connected to fossil fuels, that is alone in their concern. They always find other people who are thinking the same thing. And I think that's just one essential thing to realize. And what that opens up is an opportunity to just begin the conversation, to begin sort of asking, where are we at on this? What's our policy? Why are we just asking really straightforward questions, get more clarity about what the thinking is already. That will bring people out of the woodwork. And I think you'll find there are other people who share the concern in one way or another. And then I also want to give a shout out to my friend Adam Lerman, who works at the agency Mustache, which did sign the Clean Creatives Pledge. And he has this sort of framework for looking at it. He calls it the 6 Ps for sustainability conversations inside agencies. polite, positive, persistent, practical, punchy, patient. And I think if you sort of hold those things that, like, be as friendly as possible, meet people where they're at, continue the conversation, like don't let that put you off it. But make sure you make the steps forward as practical as possible. And just realize that it may take time. But you really, as we like to say in this campaign, more is more. The more opportunities you have to bring it up and to connect with people, the more opportunities you have to take steps forward. So there's really no wrong way to begin in my experience. But, I think look at the people around you and the company you're at and just begin to ask the questions.
James, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I think that covers a lot of it. I would just say, I would just end by saying that, as we're talking to people, it really is about finding common ground. And I think a lot of the opposition on climate change doesn't come because people have, read all the scientific data and come to a different conclusion about the crisis. That's not where climate denial is coming from. It's coming out of a place of fear. It's coming out of a place of a kind of tribal identity or a political affiliation. And so I think it's trying to find ways to cut across those boundaries and speak person to person with somebody, and come up with those, as Duncan's saying, sort of practical steps that we can be taking together. This is such a huge problem that it's hard to wrap our hands around. It's hard to know what to do as a individual creative or someone at a brand. And I think what our hope is that we're giving people clear ways that they can make a difference. And if you are in the kind of PR, creative, advertising sector, I think Clean Creatives really is a way to make a huge difference. I think within just over the last year, we've made climate a huge conversation for this sector. We've seen great commitments from hundreds of agencies. We have a foot in the door at the world's largest advertisers and PR company. I think in the coming year, we're going to see really major changes and commitments, and really major developments. And so it's exciting to me to see how much progress we've been able to make as a community on this issue going forward. And we're just constantly thrilled and excited to welcome more people into the fight.
Well, thank you so much, guys. I know, so agency owners, leadership, and individual creatives, whether in the PR or advertising world, can go to your site and sign the pledge. And there's also other social media assets on there that you can share to your social media if you're so inclined. Just want to plug that real quick. But thank you so much for joining us. I found the conversation really enlightening, and I hope our listeners do too.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for spending the last hour with us. I hope you're feeling inspired and having learned something new. Please head over to the Apple Podcasts app and leave a review. See you all next week.